Through the power of transposition, we are going to be able to see one of the specific moments that we analyzed in our files gotten through a different approach. We're going to go through the game between Susan Polgar and Julio Grande Zuniga from quite a while ago now. They played in Aruba back in 1992. It's a little bit of an old game, but the concepts haven't changed very much in this variation, and after all, it is a little bit out of touch with fashion. You won't be seeing a3 too often if players follow what the top level GMs do. So here we have a3, bishop takes e3, b takes e3, c5, e3. We all know this, and I'm recommending again the move b6, but castles was played instead here by Julio Grande, one of the greatest talents that chess has ever seen, in my opinion. A player that, of course, coming from Peru, not a traditional chess playing country, was able to still challenge the very elite. And Susan Polgar, of course, a legend herself. 92 was her choice in this position, and after knight c6, I can't really agree with the way that she developed the pieces with 92 knight g3 against a very quick knight c6 and castles. I think in this particular position, had Grande taking on d4 and played d5, or played d5 immediately, I think the challenge in the center would have been just a little bit too strong. Usually black doesn't want to do that. They shy away from this because after d5 you get back into the main waters of some Nimzo Indians. But with the knight in g3 instead of f3, white really lacks this control over the center that they have with the knight on their natural square, and instead they're gunning for the move e4. If I just prevent the move e4, then this setup kind of lacks ideas. I think that d5 here would have been very precise, but okay. Grande decided to play d6, and after e4, b6, we're actually in a position that is mentioned in our analysis. So after b6, we were already gunning for this idea of bishop a6, knight a5, attacking the pawn on c4, and you might be saying, hey, Alejandro, hadn't you said that the move bishop g5 in this position is dangerous? Because after all, there is a pin, and the push on e5 might be coming. Well, let's go back to the specifics of the position. In this case, first of all, e5 is not a threat. I am still controlling this thanks to the knight on c6. Also because the knight is not on f3. So e5 is actually not a threat in this position. And let's analyze even further. White is severely behind in development compared to other variations that we've looked at, because white played 92 and knight g3 instead of putting that bishop on f1 to d3, the knight coming to f3. Another important aspect of this position is that the move h6, and this is quite key, cannot be met with the most natural reply, which is bishop h4 to keep the pin. In this case, bishop h4 g5 simply loses a piece, the bishop has nowhere to go, and black is completely winning. Therefore, the only way of actually justifying this is after h6 playing h4. But this kind of fanciful play doesn't really require too much from black to break open. In essence, you can even take the bishop and already be in a much better position. After rook e8, which was played in the Grande game, we'll see how Grande was able to obtain a decisive advantage, but specifically I think the move c takes d4, c takes d4, h takes g5, h takes g5, g6 leads to a humongous advantage for black. In this case, I am kind of threatening to simply save my knight, put it on h7 or e8. The queen doesn't have access to h5 anymore, so I'm not that worried about this invasion down the h file. And something, for example, like bishop d3 can already be met with either knight takes d4 or simply knight h7, and black should be completely winning. If white does recapture their piece with g takes f6, then after queen takes f6, you can see that this pawn on d4 is already undefended, and it's very difficult to do anything about it. If d5, for example, queen c3 check is already completely winning, as queen d2 undefends the rook on a1, and king e2 allows knight d4 check, not to mention that king e2 is not exactly the move that white wanted to play. So after queen f6, you probably have to go something clumsy like knight e2 to defend your pawn, but bishop a6, and white's position's just completely falling apart. There is nothing the rook's doing by itself on the h file, and I'm simply taking your pawns in the center. Computer magic allows white to survive, and somehow they're not completely lost, but it is a very sizable advantage for black. black in this position. Julio instead played the move after h4, rook e8, which in some cases is quite natural, as I will be able to take this bishop, and sometimes after retreating the knight, we'll be able to escape with the king. For this reason, Susan decided to play bishop e3, though I believe the move queen f3 was most precise, as after h takes g5, h takes g5, running with the knight isn't exactly recommendable with the rook still on h8. I still have more than enough compensation after the move knight d7, queen h5, king f8, for example, queen h8, and taking on g7 is completely unclear. And if that's not enough, in many cases I do have the idea of playing e5. For example, c takes d4, which I think is the best move in the position, with the idea that after g takes f6, queen takes f6, black is again better. There's the move e5, opening up the queen against the rook on a8, and after knight takes e5, queen takes a8, knight fg4, we have a huge mess on the board where white has some sort of attack on the h-file with the queen coming back to e4, but these knights are actually quite dangerous for the opponent. This queen can take on g5, the center is collapsing, the queen can sometimes itself be trapped on a8. It is just a huge mess. I'm not going to waste too much time going into the depth of this position because after all, rook e8 shouldn't have been what black played. I think taking on d4 and taking on g5 immediately was very strong, and we're just going to follow the game. Bishop e3 was Susan's choice, but after bishop a6, these ideas of h4, h6, they don't really harm black too much. It's difficult to imagine a sacrifice on h6 going to work at any point. If the queen comes to d2, always have to deal with the move knight g4, and overall, it doesn't seem like white's really creating threats. Even if you were able to take on h6, it doesn't really lead to very much. Bishop d3 was played in this position. Rook c8, extremely logical move. Queen e2, and this is what we really want. We want white to start having to defend that pawn on c4 in unnatural ways. The queen and the bishop don't want to have the job of holding on to this pawn, but if they let it go, then the bishop will take on c4 and trade itself for some of white's pieces, and then the attack starts to dissipate and the material advantage for black will be quite considerable. In this case also, after c takes d4, c takes d4, knight a5, Julio is doing an excellent job of just hammering at white's position. You can see that this pawn on c4 is about to fall. I'm going to capture it with the bishop, and I'm not going to have any strategical problems on the king side. Rook c1 was played, and after rook e7, you can see that pieces are just piling up and piling up on c4. And if I don't have to worry about the king side, then this pawn on c4 will eventually fall because I can just increase and increase and increase the pressure without any repercussions. In this case, white decided to play a very sad move, but it's hard to recommend anything better, to be honest. If Susan had castled, then the move rook c7 just picks up the pawn on c4, and strategically this should be very close to lost. However, the move knight f1 hardly seems like a superior choice. After knight f1, knight ec7, knight d2, it's clear that white has spent way too much time in the opening trying to defend this pawn on c4, and it is no big surprise that a break here is decisive. The move d5 is indeed winning, the point being that after pawn takes d5, I can exploit this pin down the d-file, and it's a pity that Julio didn't see this move because it would have been crushing and it would have been such a nice move to take instead of taking with the pawn on d5, but to take with the queen. The idea is that I am increasing the pressure on c4. I'm also eyeing that pawn on g2, so you actually have to give up this pawn on c4. If you take my queen, this doesn't work tactically for white since check is a back rank. You must interpose your queen. I'll take it with check, and nobody is defending this bishop on d3 at the end with a win for the black pieces. Instead, after queen takes d5, the best that white can really do is short castle, but I can take with the knight, I can take with the bishop, I can really take whatever way I want to on c4, and white has a completely lost position, down a pawn, strategically vulnerable pawn on d4. This bishop is going to retreat to b7 and threaten checkmate, and we're going to reinforce this knight to c4 with b5, unless you want to trade all the pieces on the light squares on c4, and that of course gives me an extra pawn with a knight on f6 that is simply superior to the bishop on e3. This is completely decisive. Even the game continuation was very strong for black. After pawn takes d4, pawn takes d5, c5, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, knight g4 is almost winning for black as well. Castles, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes h4, and black has emerged up a pawn in this position strategically, also in a very nice situation because his pawn on c5 is hanging. However, black did allow a little bit more counterplay than he should have. I think that queen takes d5 would have really killed any kind of play that white had, whereas here Susan suddenly found herself rook f5 and some kind of ideas on the king side with the connection of e4 and bringing this rook. Now I'm going to finish the game, but it is true that in this position black is objectively winning. Perhaps it needs a little bit of care, but it is a decisive advantage without a doubt. The way that Julio played was a little bit too careless. Queen d8 is still fine, e4 and rook d7, perhaps a little bit questionable to allow this pawn all the way to e5. Here white will have the possibility of playing e6 and creating some threats. Objectively, again, still not enough to justify the lack of a pawn or the weakness on c5, but things start getting murkier and murkier, and very often in chess you want to play the most precise so that your opponent doesn't have counterplay. Had Julio done that, I'm sure that he would have won without any problems. Rook c6 was the choice move, knight f3, knight c4, and even here after rook f1, rook b7, black's still probably winning. And it's not until rook h5 appears on the board that perhaps finally white has some kind of ideas. The move rook g6 strikes me as probably the most precise, steaming some of those ideas. But after the careless b takes c5, knight g5, suddenly white found herself some kind of counterplay, and even though Judith Polgar is the one known as the greatest attacking female player of all time, it is true that if you give any Polgar sister any kind of initiative, they will destroy you. And this is what happened to Granda after g6, e5, an excellent move, f5, knight f7. Very nice continuation here by Susan. Doesn't care about the rook, knows that the queen penetration to f5 will leave this king just too weak. Notice that there's also ideas of queen g3 in this position. Granda tried to bail out with rook takes f7, pawn takes, king takes, but it's a little bit too late. After rook takes h6, this king on f7 is really suffering. The knight on c4 a little bit too far away for the defense. White now has the initiative, the exchange, even though black still has two pawns, and this is a strong advantage. This is close to move 40. I have the feeling that there was some time pressure involved, but that's just conjecture from myself, as the next moves are not very accurate. But Susan took it home very nicely with queen g5, rook h3, queen g4, takes on c5, and after queen b3 it's clear that this king isn't going to survive such an open position, whereas this king is very safely posted on h1 in case of any checks. Knight d6, and the game finished. Queen b8, rook c2, threatening checkmate on g2, but Susan is way faster. Rook h7 check, king e6, rook e1 check, rook e2, and queen g8. Black will get mated very, very soon. You cannot even put the king on the e-file because of rook takes e2 and the skewer against the queen, so Julio decided to resign. Of course, not the finish that black wanted, but it is clear that at some point black was completely winning out of the opening. Especially nice, I think, would have been this idea of queen takes d5. What I want to exemplify in this position is that you have to put attention to the particularities of a position. Normally, I have said that e4 bishop g5 is a dangerous situation for black, but we've already experienced in this game that it's not the end of the world if some conditions are met. Specifically, this knight on g3 wasn't very good because h6 allowed black to kick out the bishop or to force this awkward reply of h4, which doesn't really work, and to also notice that the development amount is very, very important. Letting knight c6, knight a5, bishop a6 doesn't do anything for black's development on the king side, so you can't count those as development on the defense of the other flank, whereas having played bishop d3, castles, and f4 would have been much more beneficial for white. So with my knight still on c6, still targeting the center, this ideas of bishop g5 shouldn't be as powerful, and in essence, because white doesn't have the development to create any threats or attack, the pawn on c4 just eventually will fall by itself. Black is going to attack in slowly but surely, and I think this was a perfect example on how white can also rush their attack with bishop g5 and find themselves in a completely lost strategical position from the very beginning.